In the Middle Ages, becoming a prisoner of war could mean very different things depending on who you were and how the battle ended. A knight taken alive might be treated with respect, kept in relative comfort while his family negotiated a ransom. For ordinary soldiers, captivity was far harsher, often marked by hunger, disease, or execution. During sieges, the cruelty intensified, with entire garrisons sometimes wiped out as a warning to others. This contrast shows how war in the medieval world mixed honor with brutality, turning prisoners into both valuable assets and expendable burdens. Number 1. Fate of the captive, knight and common soldier. In the Middle Ages, capture was a gamble shaped by rank, money, and the heat of the moment. A mailed knight pulled from his saddle carried price tags in every detail. His coat of arms identified wealthy kin. His warhorse and harness hinted at deep pockets, and his network of lords and vassals promised leverage. That made him worth more alive than dead. Captors rushed to secure names and tokens, sometimes swapping helmets to hide a trophy prisoner from chaotic looting, then escorting him to the rear as quickly as possible. From there began a familiar routine: letters sent under safe conduct, oaths to behave as a prisoner at large, and hard bargaining over a ransom that could equal years of estate income. Families mortgaged lands, city bankers advanced credit, and lords pledged sureties to bring a man home. Because ransom revenue was real money, tactics bent around it. On fields like Poitiers, or during chevauchées in France, fighters aimed to unhorse and overbear, not butcher, and men-at-arms honed the skill of closing for capture rather than delivering killing blows. That logic rarely extended to the rank and file. Common soldiers had little collateral beyond their bodies, and those bodies were a burden to feed. After a battle, especially when panic, fatigue, or rumors of a counterattack swirled, many were cut down or left to die. Others were herded together, stripped of gear, and marched as expendable labor to dig ditches, haul engines, or patch breaches during the next siege. In border wars and crusading theaters, where hatred, distance, or faith-hardened decisions, enslavement, or summary execution became more common, though even there a useful artisan or a skilled archer might be spared for service. The treatment gap also came from paperwork, or its medieval cousin, reputation. Knights traveled with heraldic identities and witnesses. Foot soldiers marched anonymous. A named captive could negotiate parole, promising not to flee or fight until ransomed. A nameless one had no one to negotiate with, and no oath that mattered to his captors. Seasoned commanders noticed the perverse incentives. Too much mercy encouraged fake surrenders. Too much cruelty killed the cash flow. Some issued orders on the spot, distinguishing between men of price and everyone else. Others reacted to battlefield pressure, as when prisoners were slain out of fear, they would pick up fallen weapons. The economics even shaped equipment. Fine harnesses and richly caparisoned horses advertised value and invited capture. A battered jack and a billhook did not. In prolonged campaigns, captives turned into currency. A baron might barter one knight for another, or hold on to a particularly important enemy to pry loose a truce or a castle key. Meanwhile, foot soldiers who survived initial sorting adapted to a gray existence, pressed into baggage trains, traded between retinues, or quietly ransomed in bundles to townsfolk who needed labor. Across Europe, the unwritten laws of arms praised honor, but custom always bent to circumstance siege storms, winter hunger, outbreaks of disease, or the arrival of mercenary companies all tilted the scale. When grain was short, or pay in arrears, prisoners suffered first. When nobles sought alliances, even bitter enemies found themselves sharing tables, while clerks haggled over figures. The result was a harsh arithmetic. For elites, captivity often meant negotiation, parole, and patient bookkeeping. For ordinary fighters, it meant a razor-thin chance of survival, rescued only by usefulness, mercy, or luck. Number 2. Knights in captivity, the honor of imprisonment. When a knight fell into enemy hands during the Middle Ages, his treatment was shaped by a unique blend of custom, economics, and political calculation. Unlike the nameless soldiers who often met swift death or were reduced to hard labor, A captured knight represented wealth and influence, and that made him worth preserving. Many were confined not in filthy pits, but within fortified castles, housed in chambers that reflected both their social standing and the captor's interest in maintaining their value. These spaces were guarded, but they were a far cry from the fetid dungeons we often imagine. Knights were frequently allowed to wear decent clothing, to maintain their dignity, and even to retain squires or servants who could attend to their needs. Daily life in this kind of captivity balanced restraint with privilege. A knight might dine with the lord of the castle, sharing bread and wine under watchful eyes, because keeping relations cordial smoothed ransom negotiations. Books, religious texts, and even chessboards found their way into prison quarters, allowing prisoners to preserve a sense of culture. In some cases, they were permitted light training with weapons, both to keep their bodies strong and because captors respected martial skill as a mark of status. Records tell of knights being allowed hunting trips under escort, with their captors confident that parole oaths bound them not to escape. Breaking parole was dishonorable and carried severe consequences for future negotiations, so many knights adhered to their sworn word even when opportunity beckoned. Ransom negotiations themselves could stretch across months or even years, and during this time, knights often became semi-integrated into the households of their enemies. These prolonged stays fostered unexpected bonds. Shared meals, tournaments held within castle walls, and religious observances gave prisoners and captors occasions to treat one another as peers rather than adversaries. There are numerous accounts where such relationships altered the course of politics, with marriages arranged between families who once faced each other on the battlefield, or alliances formed from friendships born in captivity. Knights who experienced this form of imprisonment sometimes returned to their homelands with a broader network of contacts, which they could later leverage in diplomacy or trade. The economics of ransom reinforced this relatively comfortable captivity. The value of a knight's release was tied not just to gold, but to horses, armor, and even territorial concessions. Captors had every incentive to ensure that their high-value prisoner survived in reasonable health. A dead noble brought nothing but potential retaliation, while a living one might fund entire campaigns. This explains why even in violent wars, such as the 100 Years' War, chroniclers describe knights being captured carefully, their equipment collected, and their ransom negotiated through clerks and heralds rather than through brute coercion. Yet this privileged form of imprisonment was not universal or automatic. A knight taken in a furious siege, where defenders had resisted to the last, could be treated far more harshly. Religious wars added another layer of unpredictability, as in the Crusades, where knights might be sold into slavery in distant markets despite their status. Still, within much of Europe, the shared culture of the warrior elite established a rough code of conduct. Captivity became a recognized stage of a knight's career, one that tested patience, resilience, and the strength of family resources as much as it tested courage on the battlefield. Over time, this system of honorable captivity left an enduring mark on the way warfare was conducted. It created incentives to capture rather than kill, added a financial logic to battles, and reinforced the class divide that separated knights from the common infantry. More than simple detention, knightly imprisonment functioned as a negotiation table, a proving ground for loyalty, and at times even a bridge between enemies. It was a reminder that in the brutal world of medieval war, social status could redraw the line between survival and annihilation. Number 3. Common soldiers, darkness and hunger. Sorting began the moment fighting stopped, and it was brutal in its simplicity. Men with names, horses, and coats of arms were assets. Men without them were liabilities. Captors kept a handful of sturdy footmen for chores, but most rankers faced a narrow menu of outcomes. Summary killing when panic or vengeance flared, impressment into hard labor, sale or transfer to towns that needed hands, or a hungry spell in custody while someone decided what to do next. Where the law of arms protected elites through ransom and parole, ordinary prisoners lived under ad hoc rules set by commanders, paymasters, and supply wagons. Conditions reflected that status. Instead of chambers in a keep, commoners were penned in timbered sheds, cellars, or purpose-built pits. Some castles had rough holding rooms near the gatehouse, with a latrine chute and little else. Days blurred into the same routine. Fetch water under guard, haul stones, carry timber for siege works, clear ditches, and drag wounded animals tasks that kept men near the lines and exposed to stray shot. Food ran thin fast. Guards favoured their own bellies first. Prisoners ate crusts, thin pottage, or nothing at all when wagons failed to arrive. In damp spaces, clothes mildewed, lice spread, and minor wounds turned lethal. Water drawn from moats or fouled cisterns bred dysentery, and the cold in unheated rooms did the rest. Mortality rose sharply in winter quarters, or during long sieges when commanders rationed grain by rank. Exchange schemes rarely reached this level. Clerks tracked gentlemen with sealed letters, while nameless billmen and crossbowmen went unrecorded. Some captives were marched for days to secondary strongholds or market towns, chained in batches, shedding stragglers to exposure and disease. Others were assigned to work crews with local serfs, indistinguishable except for accents and torn kit. Frontier and crusading theatres added harsher edges. Enslavement appeared alongside labour drafts, and faith or ethnicity could erase what little value a foot soldier had. Even in Western Europe, fear could turn policy overnight. After sudden alarms or rumours of fresh enemy forces, guards killed captives rather than risk a breakout, while high-value men were hurried to the rear. Looting habits shaped outcomes too. A footman stripped in the rout lost not just warmth and dignity. Without gear, he was harder to trade and easier to abandon. A minority survived by being useful. A mason could be kept to mend walls. A carter who knew local roads might guide for rations. A farrier might save a troop's horses and earn slightly larger portions. Escape was possible but rare. Parole was almost unheard of for commoners because their promises carried no weight. The wider system made this predictable. Ransom culture pushed combatants to spare elites and neglect the rest. Prison architecture and routines were never designed for long-term mass custody. And the supply logic of medieval armies guaranteed that when carts ran empty, prisoners suffered first. Chronicles and household accounts leave the pattern clear. For ordinary soldiers, captivity was less a legal category than a temporary state between labour, sale, release by happenstance, or death from cold, hunger, or the next commander's decision. Number 4. Siege brutality and mass executions. In the Middle Ages, battles in the open field were dangerous, but it was the sieges that truly embodied the cruelty of war. When armies surrounded castles or fortified towns, the defenders knew their fate depended less on skill and more on negotiation and timing. If a garrison chose to surrender early, especially before the besiegers had invested heavily in siege engines and manpower, mercy was sometimes granted. Defenders might be spared, though usually stripped of weapons and wealth, and forced into captivity. This was not generosity, but pragmatism. Armies preferred to preserve resources and move on, rather than waste time and lives. The story was completely different when walls fell after a bloody storm. The unwritten rule was that resistance to the last invited annihilation. Soldiers who fought until the final breach were rarely shown leniency. Chronicles describe how, after breaches at cities like Béziers in 1209 or Jerusalem in 1099, entire populations were cut down regardless of age or status. In Béziers, during the Albigensian Crusade, the infamous phrase, "Kill them all, God will know his own," reflected the scale of slaughter. These massacres served not only as vengeance, but as deliberate tools of psychological warfare. By showcasing what awaited a stubborn garrison, commanders could terrify neighboring towns into surrender without a fight. Treatment of captives after a siege was shaped by both logistics and ideology. Feeding hundreds of enemy soldiers after a stormed castle was an impossible burden for armies that already struggled to supply their own ranks. Killing prisoners was cruel, but, in the brutal logic of the time, efficient. At times, survivors were mutilated hands or noses cut off to send a message and reduce their ability to fight again. The Crusades added another layer of intensity. Religious zeal stripped away restraints, and the slaughter of prisoners became framed as holy justice. After the fall of Jerusalem in 1099, Accounts tell of streets running with blood, with knights, foot soldiers, and civilians all subject to the same fate. The symbolism of such brutality was meant to signal divine favor as much as military dominance. Yet not every siege ended in bloodshed. There are examples of negotiated surrenders where defenders secured terms for safe passage, especially in conflicts between Christian lords in Europe. Sometimes entire garrisons were allowed to march out, though without arms, as part of agreements that recognized mutual interest in preserving noble lives for future ransoms. Even so, these agreements could be fragile. An impatient commander or mercenary force might break terms and slaughter prisoners regardless, undermining the thin fabric of trust that governed medieval warfare. The recurring reality of siege warfare was that captives' lives depended on the circumstances of surrender. Early capitulation meant survival, though in chains. Late resistance meant near certain death. The brutality was systemic, not random. It was part of how medieval armies operated, blending economic necessity, logistical calculation, and deliberate terror. This combination explains why chroniclers so often emphasize the fall of castles and cities. Each one was a turning point where thousands of lives could be spared or destroyed in a single decision. For common defenders, it meant their loyalty to a lord could seal their fate, while for besiegers, it reinforced the grim message that defiance carried a catastrophic cost. Number 5. Tactics, economics, and the ransom hunt. Medieval warfare ran on coin as much as courage, and nothing reveals that better than the way fighters tried to turn enemies into assets instead of corpses. On the field, the technique shows up everywhere. Men-at-arms drove with the lance to unhorse, then closed with grapples, poleaxes, and daggers to pin an opponent without killing him, because a breathing knight in fine harness carried a price. Captors shouted for witnesses, stripped crests and surcoats to mark possession, and hustled valuable prisoners to the rear before the melee shifted. A moment's delay could see a prize snatched by another retinue. Contracts mattered. Under indentures and household ordinances, the man who made the capture took the lion's share of the ransom, but owed cuts to his captain, and sometimes the crown. So even tactics inside a scrum reflected accounting squires and archers dogpiled a fallen noble, because every hand on the hauberk could claim a portion later. The promise of ransom bent strategy too. Raiding chevauchés prized speed and panic, but when elite resistance stiffened, commanders tamped down killing blows and encouraged overbearing captures. In set-piece battles, companies trained to burst formations, isolate bannered men, and break their morale without annihilating them. Once secured, the economics kicked in. Value scaled with lineage, office, and kit, so a baron in gilded bassinet could underwrite a year's campaigning, while a poor knight fetched sums that still strained a family estate. Payment rarely meant a sack of coins on a table. Negotiations ran through heralds and notaries, with oaths of parole letting captives live under guard, or even at large, while surety's relatives, vassals, or a bonded town guaranteed the debt. Collateral could be anything portable or fungible: chargers, mail, jewelry, manuscripts, even rights to tolls, and when ready cash failed, treaties bridged the gap hostages substituted for money, castles changed hands as security, or marriage ties sealed the bargain. The same logic scaled to communities. Towns under threat paid compositions to avert sack. Garrisons bargained for safe conduct in exchange for handing over keys before the storm. Between equals, the calculus stayed cool, because everyone expected to play both roles eventually. Warriors remembered who honored parole and who did not, and reputations set the interest rate on future deals. That said, finance never erased risk. Feeding and guarding dozens of captives squeezed marching armies already short on grain. A sudden breach or the rumor of an enemy relief could flip the ledger from profit to peril, and that's when killings erupted despite potential ransom. Free companies and mercenaries sharpened the edge further. For routiers on the move, prisoners were walking paydays. For condottieri under contract, captives were bargaining chips to tweak arrears or leverage city-states at truce tables. Kings exploited the same tool at a higher tier. Treaties pegged to staggered payments kept rival courts bound for years, with hostages standing in for missed installments and chanceries tracking arrears the way merchants tracked bills of exchange. The hunt for ransom even shaped equipment and display flashy caparisons, broadcast status and risk, while some veterans dressed plainer on dangerous frontiers to avoid painting a target on themselves. In the end, the business model of capture sat alongside honor, not beneath it. It rewarded restraint in the crush, taught retinues to recognize value instantly, and threaded money through every stage of combat, from the first clash of lances to the last sealing wax on a bond. When it worked, a single prisoner could finance a campaign and stitch new alliances across enemy lines. When it failed, a commander paid twice, once in lost profit and again in blood from enraged foes who concluded the rules no longer applied. Number 6. Life and legacy of captivity. The experience of imprisonment during the Middle Ages shaped not only the fate of individuals, but also the broader culture of war and society. For knights and nobles, captivity was often remembered as a defining chapter in their careers. Chroniclers and poets turned these episodes into stories of endurance, and in chivalric literature, the figure of the captive knight became a familiar motif. Such tales emphasized honor maintained under pressure, loyalty to one's word, and the belief that even in chains, nobility endured. Memoirs and chronicles record not only hardships, but also the negotiations, friendships, and rivalries that emerged in the liminal space between war and peace. These accounts filtered into the imagination of later generations, embedding the idea that war was not only fought with swords, but also with pledges and ransoms. On the practical level, the ransom system created a financial infrastructure that had lasting consequences. The sums demanded for noble captives were immense, sometimes equal to the annual revenues of whole estates or towns. Raising that money required credit, and this need stimulated networks of merchants, bankers, and notaries. In Italian city-states, in Flanders, and later in London and Paris, new financial instruments were used to manage ransom debts, from letters of exchange to complex surety arrangements. Hostages taken to guarantee payment created another layer of political entanglement, forcing noble families into webs of obligation that could shape alliances long after a war ended. This constant circulation of wealth through ransom helped integrate war into the wider economic life of Europe and laid groundwork for the rise of more formal financial systems. For common soldiers, the legacy was different and far more tragic. Few left written accounts, but archaeological evidence and legal records testify to their fate. Many died in captivity from hunger, disease, or deliberate killing. Others survived as coerced labor, building fortifications or serving as menials in households. In frontier regions and during crusading campaigns, large groups were sold into slavery, scattered far from their homelands. These experiences underscored the deep social divide within medieval armies, where the code of ransom applied only to those whose lives carried measurable value. The contrast between knightly, honorable captivity and the misery of foot soldiers highlighted the realities of a hierarchical society in which worth was literally priced. Captivity also functioned as a political tool. Important prisoners became pawns in diplomatic games, their release tied to treaties, marriages, or oaths of loyalty. Monarchs exploited this leverage, using noble captives to secure truces or territorial concessions. The practice blurred the line between war and diplomacy, making prisons extensions of the negotiation table. At the same time, brutality and mass executions in siege warfare revealed the limits of chivalric restraint. The memory of massacres at places like Jerusalem or Béziers lived on in chronicles, reminders that the so-called laws of war were inconsistently applied and easily abandoned when passion, faith, or necessity dictated. The cultural impact of these practices endured beyond the Middle Ages. Later thinkers and jurists, reflecting on the chaos of medieval captivity, began to argue for clearer rules governing prisoners of war. The uneven treatment ransom for some, death for others, contributed to the eventual development of more systematic laws of armed conflict. In this sense, the harsh lessons of medieval captivity, from the bookkeeping of ransoms to the horrors of mass killings, provided the foundation on which later societies built the idea of regulated wartime conduct. The life of a prisoner in the Middle Ages was never a fixed condition. It was a mirror of status, wealth, and power. But its legacy ran deeper, reshaping economies, inspiring literature, and forcing the gradual recognition that even in war, human lives required rules.